Collections Technology Think Tank 5.2. Just wanted to welcome everybody. For those who've just joined us, welcome to our Collections Technology Think Tank session 2, where we're going to talk about collections risk, measuring affordability and vulnerability a lot in there. So we're looking forward to talking about that. For those who missed our last session, talking mainly about customer engagement, that's been obviously taken place but been recorded, so we'll share that roundup online soon, in terms of you can view it, and also the little review of some of the polls and questions, straw poll from the event. So that's great. Just want to talk really briefly about this session. So as you can see, we want you to engage if you can on this. So social media platforms, use the hashtag #CollectionsTechTT. Bit of information on the screen in front of you. There's an I button that gives you information on the event. Have a look at our other Credit Connect events coming up as well later on this year, so have a look at that. We've got like a people icon, so click on that for more information about our speakers. And then also you've got a box where you can view links and download stuff. Click on that as well, and you can find out more about our sponsor in this session, which is Moneyhub. So we'd like to thank them for that, and obviously our sponsor last session, Financial Cloud. But if you click on that button, there's a link to Moneyhub, and you can find out more about them and one of our speakers who's in this session. There's also some polls that are going to appear on screen. Please, they're anonymous, so please take part in them if you want. We will share the roundup, but not individual responses, so please take part in that. But the most important icon of all is top left, second one down, speech icon. Please ask questions. We'd really like you to share them with our panel, and we can put that to them and get their feedback. And that will be moderated by our chair for the day, which is, I'm going to introduce now, Chris Warburton from RO Strategy. I'm going to hand over to you shortly, and he will give you an introduction to all the speakers, and we'll get this conversation started. So Chris, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin, and welcome back, everyone. As Colin said, so my name's Chris Warburton. I look after RO Strategy, and the last few years I've also been doing quite a lot of work, including with Colin, really just looking around just like a lot of the trends that are taking place in terms of technology and the themes in terms of cloud collections. And I've got a site, roar.com as well. So this conversation here, we're going to very much sort of focus on collections risk, measuring affordability and vulnerability, and it sort of links on a little bit from the previous session, which was really around collections communication engagement. I think we had a great conversation with that. But joining me for this conversation, we've got three great speakers. We've got Sheraz Afzal, who's the Group Legal Risk and Compliance Director from Quint Group. We've got Phillip Hirons, who's the Collections Operations Manager from Billing Finance. And last, we've got Suzanne Homewood, who's the Managing Director from Moneyhub. So to the three of you, welcome, and very much enjoying this conversation. And I say, this conversation is going to be about affordability, vulnerability. We know, and we talked about in the last session around cost of living, financial pressures on households. It's probably top of mind or top of conversation, especially with the election, I suppose, going on in the background. And it's sort of become kind of crucial as well, even from a regulatory point of view, where there's all this focus around affordability. We've got consumer duty in the background as well, really trying to identify vulnerable customers. So we're going to talk a bit about that today. What are we actually seeing that's going on? How do we need to start thinking about it? And then importantly, how do we respond to that as an industry too. So to kick off, I suppose, just wanted to start off just talking about sort of trends that are being seen as much as anything. And Phillip, I was maybe going to come to you first in terms of, I mean, what's happened with the cost of living crisis as an example. It feels like we talked a lot about that at the end of last year. It doesn't feel like that's in the news, at least labelled as cost of living crisis. What are you kind of seeing in terms of financial difficulty, affordability?
Sure. I think that label is exactly what's gone rather than maybe the problems that people are facing.
Yeah.
I think one of those challenges is, how long is it a crisis before we sit and just say the UK is an expensive place to live, the cost of living's expensive, and that you think a crisis almost has like impending change, I guess. And there becomes a point where, we're in an expensive world, rather than maybe still referring to the events of 2021 and the changes that's caused. What we're seeing, I mean, customers are definitely still sort of struggling financially. It's definitely difficult for people. And I think people are seeing that sort of financial resilience and, that good stuff tested. And I think it's just you mentioned there about assessing affordability. Costs are rising for people at a rate that makes that incredibly difficult. We saw with that base rate last week, I think it was, staying flat, and another 125,000 people coming to the end of their fixed term mortgages. I think there's a big challenge, a big question asked on when assessing affordability. How much, I guess the word I'm looking for is like, how much room do you need to leave for potential living expenses to increase when sort of assessing that affordability margin?
Yeah, I mean, Suzanne, you're nodding there in terms of like, what are some of the things you've been hearing from clients? I mean, you're obviously in the personalized digital sort of like journey kind of space to sort of understand that and sort of develop some of that. I mean, what are you kind of hearing from your interactions?
Yeah, no, absolutely right. The ability for people to pay their bills, normal bills, is becoming harder, and so we're seeing people going into their overdrafts more for longer, taking out loans to pay off debts on loans. This is just the situation's just being exacerbated where people are just doing anything to make ends meet. We did some research recently, and I think it was 27% of the population of, I think we called it, been involved in some risky financial behaviour, which is, as I said, late with paying credit cards, late with paying for products, overdraft, etc. And the really concerning part of that is that 63% of those people, it is just rising bills. And so it's not as if people are doing crazy things with their money, that they just can't afford to pay their bills. So yeah, our customers are saying exactly the same as Phillip. It's becoming more difficult to manage and predict forwards, because they've got more people have going into that really can't pay, and they've never been in that position before. So how do you manage your own metrics and your own kind of controls on the basis of how many people are going to fall into collections going forwards?
Yeah, I mean, I quite like what you said, Phil, around the word crisis, right? Because a crisis kind of implies that it's something that's going to happen, it's going to go away. And what you're kind of saying, Suzanne, is like it's like maybe crisis has gone away because it's not like in a murder, but like the situation just carrying on. Now it's just like inflation. This is just the way we've got to respond to it. And I suppose, like, how do we as businesses try and respond to that? I mean, Sheraz, how if this is the new normal, maybe is a better way of saying it. I mean, how do we think about that in terms of like helping to manage customers? And what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, look, I think it's absolutely right to make the point that the word crisis implies that the crisis will abate. I think we get quite bogged down in microeconomics, right? And we think about what day-to-day stuff. We don't really think, I think, enough long-term about sort of the structure of our economy, and that's really important, right? Because with the word economy, I've always thought sounds quite grandiose, but actually it's individual humans going about with jobs and spending the money, right? And the economy is the word we use to describe the sum total of all humans going about doing those things. But on a sort of a macroeconomic level, right, I think there's 2 points. One is we've lived in the last 15-20 years in a world of cheap money so that's kind of part one, right? So actually credit is just going to become more expensive comparative to the point where it has been over the last 10 to 15 years. I think secondly, I think we need to sort of just think about the fact that we live in a world in which energy has been cheap for years, right? And all of our supply chains are based around cheap energy. And that doesn't just relate to the price that we pay for bills, that relates to the price we pay for goods, right? Because what the stuff we're buying in the shop takes energy to produce and to transport. So I think structurally we're kind of getting to this point where Phil's absolutely spot on, right? Costs of living are it's not a crisis. We're entering into a new paradigm, I think, really, where everything is going to get more and more expensive whilst we wean ourselves off this supply chain where sort of energy is cheap. Now, I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think what that means is the solutions we're thinking about have got to be long-term sustainable solutions that will last into this sort of, let's call it credit 3.0, right? We can't put in place things like you know what, the sort of the temporary payment holidays that we did for COVID, right? Those are sort of short-term measures that implied that there would be a normality kind of coming. I think we need to adjust to the fact that there is, you know, this is, so I hate the phrase the new normal, right? But I think, you know, we need to adjust our expectations to the new structure of our economy.
I mean, how much do you think we've still got further to go? So one of the things that struck me with inflation is it's not the same on everything. So for example, as you're just saying, around energy costs have driven, for example, food costs, like restaurants, foods, groceries seem to have gone up significantly. Other things seem to almost been a little bit lagged. So you know, so other things, for example, like particularly where there's like inventory that's still in there. I mean, how much more do you think we're going to see it flow through? So this almost like to reach this new paradigm, it's still got a way to flow through. I mean, so like, how much more do you think we're going to basically see, Phil? I mean, what's your, or Philip? What do you kind of think? How much more do you think we need to be prepared for that?
I think personally, I'd say to be more prepared for it not going away. Then I think it may be getting too much more difficult for people. Like it's a guess, but in all honesty, the 4th of July outcome. Originally, I think a couple of years ago, I'd have thought changes, you know, confidence levels, trust levels may have been quite heavily impacted by that. And we know how that correlates in the economy. Right now, I'm not sure a different result to maybe what we have today would cause those different changes. So I think it is more, this isn't going to go away. People are not out of the woods yet in terms of it. And I think some of it is just really understanding some of what's happening. What I mean by that is there was some positivity around inflation going down. And my only worry is that at a sort of an early entry consumer level, it was almost like, oh, things are going to get cheaper then. Where inflation going down just meant they didn't increase by the amount that they were increasing by before. And I guess it's just really important that people are understanding that that's what's happening. Inflation going down isn't cost going down. It's a slowing in the cost going up, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's always quite frustrating around that definition. I suppose in the background, we've also got the FCA talking about vulnerability. I mean, that's been a hot theme, really, I suppose, across the industry for a few years. In fact, every single time we seem to talk about it. I mean, now one of the things they are changing is they're changing the definitions. It feels like the definition around affordability, but also vulnerability, seems like that's broadening. I mean, how do you think the widening of that is almost like going to impact us from financial services? And do you think almost like a too broad a definition, where it's almost like if you label something, you sort of expect action on it? So if you label it as a crisis, you expect a solution to a crisis. What you need to do is redesign something. If you label someone as vulnerable, you have a solution for it. But if everyone's vulnerable, does that sort of like devalue it to a certain extent? I mean, Suzanne, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that. I mean, is it almost like becoming too broad?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, actually. You know, consumer duty is fantastic from my point of view because it's holding everybody to account for what they're doing, what they're providing, and making sure, you know, as we know, outcomes are right for everybody. But I think, you know, going back to the point earlier of being able to see into the future and see when people are going to be affected. And there are so many short-term things that can affect people's finances, which then under new regs put them straight into vulnerable. But the reality is that could be very short-term. And you could end up with, as you say, too many buckets of vulnerability. On the other hand, I think it's really important that we have these definitions and that we have ways in which we can manage and ensure that we're, I guess, preempting, because whilst we can't see into the future, you can make predictions of and monitor people's behaviours. And I think that's the biggest gap that Consumer Duty is going to fill, if you like, is not just allowing people to bumble on into something, but using data, using insights, using better communication tools, probably from your previous conversation, to be able to actually engage with customers ahead of, and you know, as experts, see that they're going into vulnerability rather than wait for them to get into vulnerability. I think that's the important part of this definition of vulnerability. It's the actions that we take before it happens or as we see it happening that stop it getting worse. And there's no easy answer to any of this. At the end of the day, if people are going to struggle to pay for services that they've already got, or loans or products that they've already got, there's a challenge to be had for everybody. But it is just doing more to help before it becomes a problem.
Yeah, and I suppose part of that is Sheraz is going to ask you around I suppose that there's a value in having a label to a certain extent, because it allows you to identify and group it, although it probably not necessarily representative across the wider group, like you're sort of saying, Suzanne. It's like a lot of people have vulnerability and they might not be labeled as that. So you want to sort of broaden the definition to maximize treatment, but there's also a value in having a label as well. I mean, do you think how do you think we sort of like navigate that? I mean, I suppose we have to stay true, I suppose, at a customer level. I mean, what are your kind of thoughts?
So I think, if everyone's vulnerable, then does the label have value, right? I guess that's sort of the overarching question. Or everyone's potentially vulnerable. And there's sort of, I think, two ways of looking at that, right? One is, well, it's not helpful because it doesn't really give us any segmentation, and so everyone's the same, so why sort of label it? And I think there's some truth to that, right? Because if you think about the lists of things that can, cause vulnerability, I mean, in a previous generation, you might just call that life, right? Life happens. Sometimes, you get bumps in the road, and you know what? Resilience is a quality that gets tested by those bumps in the road. Bereavement is a thing that will happen to everybody. So to some extent, I think it's true to say that vulnerability, everyone's potentially vulnerable because life can happen to anybody. I think where it does add value, though, is it begins to, so I always think regulation is designed to help businesses understand the human behind the other end of the process, So for example, and the analogy I'd always make, right, was, if you're having an argument with a friend in the pub and they brought a grievance to your door, right, you wouldn't say to them, I reject your complaint, with very formal language. You'd sort of say, look, I don't agree with you, right, but whatever. And actually, I think some of that formality that FS in particular uses kind of creates that kind of those kind of barriers, right? So actually, I think the point of sort of vulnerability, in a way, or one of the points, is to say, well, look, when somebody is vulnerable, actually don't treat them like someone who isn't vulnerable, right? Change things. Like, so I'll give you an example. My mother-in-law passed away recently, so I've been trying to sort out her affairs, right? I mean, there's a prominent and famous credit card provider, right, who I've had to ring up 5 times to try and talk to the complaints team, right? And if I don't tick the box of a vulnerable customer, then with bereavement, then I don't know who does. And all I want to do is talk to somebody about this balance she's got outstanding, because I don't think she should have, she's 85. What the hell were they doing giving her a 10 grand credit limit, right? She's living on a pension. That just seems daft to me. Still can't get through the complaints team. It opens from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m, right? It doesn't work on Wednesdays or Fridays. I mean, at no point has somebody said, hey, this is a bot. And so I think actually it is useful to have that label, because so when the FCA talk about tailoring outcomes, tailoring solutions to provide outcomes, what they mean is, in reality, be a human and not a process automaton, right? And the number of people that I've been talking to who are behaving like process automatons is staggering. So I do a little trick. I go into the FCA register and I look at the person that does the SMF16 job, and I send them an email saying, hey, from one practitioner to another, have a think about this. Sadly, this credit card company hasn't got their SMF16's contact details on, so I can't do my normal shapes.
I think it's a really, I love it. I love that. It's a really important point, isn't it? Because FCA claim that as it's the fair treatment, isn't it? They want fair treatment for people who are in that difficult circumstance and situation. And when I'm talking to particularly large organisations, we're talking about changes to be made and how they're going to use data and all that kind of stuff. It often comes back to, oh no, but our customers won't want that. They don't want to do that. But I always challenge that situation, because we on this call are lucky enough that we understand our financial services. We probably do understand our own finances, and we understand the language. 99% of the population don't. And that's the biggest thing that has to change. I absolutely agree with you, Sheraz, that you can't keep talking to customers in product language because it just doesn't work. And then you have to be open to take feedback and help. That's fair treatment. That's helping people understand what they've got, why they've got it, and what the impact is when, as you say, bumps in the road, life happens. So yeah, and a lot of the programs that are being run are either really basic but really don't hit the target, or so far the other way in the protection of the bank or the organization. They're really forgetting the fundamentals in the middle, which is the customer, the language, and the understanding.
And it's hard, right? Because you have a process to try and get, because people often equate consistency with fairness, right? And that was a huge thing when TCF first came out. Everyone went, I do it all the same, so it must be fair. And actually, well, that's sort of not the case. And so that's why we kind of have a process, right? But in a previous life, we took a radical step of doing a pilot in collections, and we effectively got people we paid collection staff 3 times what we were doing normally. So I think our normal collection salary was 20k, and we thought we'd do a pilot, right, and say, let's get some 3 senior managers, right, we're paying 60 grand a year, and let's give them a portfolio of cases and see what happens, right? Suddenly, actually our cost per processing didn't treble, because the people who felt the mandate to talk to humans as humans and not to actually just got to the outcome quicker, right? So there's less friction in the overall process, because you give somebody with a bit more expertise, more training, and more crucially mandate, they'll then get to that outcome quicker. And we were sat there staggered, going, our collections are up. Our costs are a bit higher, but that's sort of offset by collections being up, and our costs haven't trebled, right? But then to try and then get that passed, hey, I want to give everybody in collections, I want to completely change this, right? Instead of being quite an entry-level job, I want it to be, a professional, aspirational job. That was quite difficult as a concept to sort of grapple with, right? But to some extent, that's the sort of paradigm shift we kind of, when I'm talking making structural changes that can work in the long term, right? When life happens, why is it fair to have a firm, give an entry-level person, right? And think about, Suzanne, you made the point, right? We understand FS really well. But when we're talking to somebody who's an entry-level person, I can feel the information asymmetry happen, right? But then imagine putting, I don't want to say a muggins, because that implies we're all wizards, right? But imagine putting the 99% of people who are trying to, it's almost like the blind talking to the blind, right? And the process is trying to help them kind of get there. And it's not working, right? Because life's happening quite a lot. And structurally, more and more, volatility will happen for those factors described. And we need to kind of rethink that engineering.
Yeah, and Philip, so like someone sort of in the operational world as well. What's your reaction, I suppose, to what Sheraz was saying in terms of outside of three times your salary, which I'm sure sure you'd love, but it's how do you feel about that, I suppose, in terms of like that engagement and giving the autonomy and the ability to be able to control to the agents? Have we done enough of that, do you think, particularly in the vulnerability kind of affordability kind of world?
Sure. I think when it comes to the vulnerability, and just to go back on the point as well about like everyone could be considered vulnerable, potentially vulnerable, and the buckets and the definitions of the past, what we've looked to do is try and, I guess, take all the approaches, and I'll try and explain what I mean here, but everyone can be vulnerable. So for a lot of things, let's just make everything better for everyone. What I mean by that is nobody wants a letter that's particularly hard to understand, regardless of their mental capacity. Nobody wants a journey that's particularly hard to navigate. Yeah, early on, it was almost, if this is your, say, vulnerable team function, well, their letters went from size 10 to size 12. And I think broaden it to everyone, one, just improves it. But two, there's going to be a lot of people you could consider vulnerable that you haven't even identified, and you're making the journey better for them without even having identified it. And then the more, like you were talking about, sort of control to agent, I guess what we would now consider a vulnerable customer, as much as I hate the word, and I think if I refer to my nan as vulnerable, I'd be in all sorts of trouble, is the actual people who are vulnerable either to us or we're vulnerable to them. And what I mean by that is we're looking at the individualized, the agents actually dealing with those people who have a support need, to say, use our product, use our service, rather than previously it was almost like buckets, wasn't there? If you've got a health condition, we've got customers who have health conditions who can perfectly well manage their finances, communicate with us, and everything that we need of them. Are they vulnerable? At the same time, we've got the same customer, not the same customer, sorry, a different customer with the same circumstances that affects them differently, who do need that extra help. And we have put that, to our people to train them to understand how does this affect you? How does this affect your ability to interact with us, to manage the product we offer? And then what do you need from us to be able to do that? So we've tried to keep both approaches. Everyone is vulnerable in the sense of every meeting, every project, have somebody in there who is, raising that what about the vulnerable customer question when we're making changes, and make them better for everyone, because anything that's too hard, nobody wants it to be difficult. None of us get a letter from the bank and be like, I wish this was harder to understand, or I wish this took me longer to work out. And then that more niche side of not categorizing by health condition, by life event, but by how it's affected them, what harms that potentially exposes them to. And then, giving our people that, I guess, empowerment to adapt those journeys for those specific people.
Yeah, and I suppose, a certain amount of that is, I quite like good customer outcomes, because it becomes personal rather than sort of like these generic kind of levels. But we talked a lot about vulnerability. We haven't talked about financial difficulty. I'll ask the same question around that, which is, how do we separate vulnerability versus financial difficulty? But also all the talk there is around cost of living, as an example. Are we almost like normalizing financial difficulty? Sheraz, you were saying, like, it's almost like to a certain extent life happens to a certain extent. But is it, how do we start thinking about financial difficulty within the context of vulnerability? Philip, just get your perspective first, and then we'll go back to Suzanne.
No, sure. So are we normalizing it? I think to an extent. I think sometimes, when all you hear is that times are tough and the financial difficulties, whether that's the media, you do get that self-fulfilling prophecy at times. I've heard it, in our call centers, that they'll sort of be discussing, and like the previous, discussion this morning around income and expenditure forms, those longer calls, and hearing discussions with customers who almost feel that they can't afford it. But then when we're trying to understand why, maybe they can, if that makes sense. But whilst there's normalizing of it, I don't think we can take away that most cases, I think, people are struggling out there, and it's about just identifying who those people are.
Suzanne, the fact that we're talking about it, and we talk a lot about, we talked about the, cost of living crisis as an example, and it was in the media. Do you think that flags up to sort of like generate more conversations? Maybe that's a good thing to a certain extent, but it can that kind of change volumes in terms of what comes through for suppliers?
Yeah, we live in a world where we're bombarded by other people's lives, and I think this is a common thing, isn't it? Whoever said the new normal. The new normal is I'll judge my own life by everybody else's rather than my current situation, and certainly we're hearing, Philip, your point of people don't think they can afford something, whereas actually possibly they can if they made some tweaks to their lifestyle. I'm hearing all the time through affordability assessments that our customers are making that there is often areas that people could make tweaks on, but don't want to. They don't want to stop buying the coffee. They don't want to stop having their Thursday and Friday and Saturday takeaways. They want to have that lifestyle that is reflected back at them in social media, and that they want to enjoy. And so therefore the tweaks go on the stuff that they have to pay for, like the services. And I think, and I'm not saying that that's a wrong thing. We all want to live our lives and have a great time, and balance is really important. But I think access to things like buy now, pay later, short-term loans just makes all of that a little bit easier for consumers to I want this, I'm going to have it, and all these other things, well, I'll worry about that when that comes along, and I know I can have a conversation with my lending organization because I know that they'll help me out. Again, is all of that wrong? It's very easy to sit and say, be critical of people and how they want to live their lives, but we're all in the same boat. But I think where we can help people is people don't truly know what's happening. So, our platform, we have the personal financial management insights, the data insights, affordability based on open banking. And one of the things when we get people to download, we have an app as well, download the app and can see their finances in one place. And you kind of say to them, what surprised you most? And most people say, I didn't realize how much I spent on whatever their favorite restaurant is or whatever brand takeaway. People are surprised when they look at their finances about how much they spend. And that's why I think in collections, particularly, if you could start showing people their true finances through open banking, you actually help them to see what their behaviors are. Because, ask anybody how much you spent on groceries last week. Your teams will all know. I've got no idea. Do you mean a week, month, £100, £200, 50 quid? No idea. Whereas, of course, the data is there. And I think the education helps that affordability.
How do we think about, I suppose, there's the objectiveness of it, which is, you spend so much on, I don't know, let's say it was skiing, holidays and cigarettes. I'm going to pick those kind of examples. You spend so much on that. And of course, like if I don't go on skiing holidays, of course you can save money by not going on skiing holidays, but you might see that as being needed. If I don't smoke, I can say, well, you should give up smoking because that's what, but if you don't have a lot of money, then maybe smoking is a really important thing for you because it's a little bit of enjoyment. And there's an emotional attachment to that versus the hard nose where you can just cut everything out. I mean, and where's the balance that we need to have in collections between that, the facts, I suppose, but then also the emotional relationship people have with money and how that links their lifestyle? Because that often it's very easy to be judgmental rather than being factual, but we also need to be sort of empathetic as well. I mean, Sheraz, I know we were talking about some of the scarcity stuff you were talking beforehand. I mean, that was kind of interesting in terms of that psychology element of it, as well as just the factual, objective kind of element of it.
So I think that's a really good point, and I couldn't have asked for anyone a better cross into the box for me to now sort of head in from Suzanne there, and I promise you, Suzanne and I didn't
penalty without a goalkeeper. That's what it was
on this. Yeah, there's jumping out. Look, I think so. Behavioral economics is something that people talk about a lot, right? I've spent 7 or 8 years really studying it because I was fascinated by why clever people make bad decisions, right? I worked for some big failing companies, and I just looked at the number of people with big salaries doing stupid things and tried to figure out why that was happening. Broadly, I would summarize and say behavioral economics posits that humans don't behave rationally. Humans behave from a series of kind of heuristics, emotions, right? And we tell ourselves stories, post-event reasoning to explain what we've done. So a lot of the approach that we take around collections, and it's driven by regulation, right, is to be rational. So let's do an affordability assessment, which is income minus expenditure, leaves us a number. Almost it's saying, prove to me you don't need a loan to get a loan, right? Which just when you put it that way, just seems bizarre. And then in collections, I think what the scarcity analysis, which is part of behavioral economics, is it begins to explain why people make these decisions, which seem to us to be irrational. And what the sort of the studies, and there are many studies, and they've been replicated around the world, and so it's growing to become a relatively solid piece of analysis now, says when somebody gets an income shock, right, they start to behave suboptimally. And suboptimally is defined as, look, there's no objective way you could reason that's good for you, right? So it's not like, so for example, people talk about the time discounting value of money. So, jam today or jam tomorrow, right? That's actually a rational calculation to make. When people have an income shock and they enter into what we call scarcity mindset, they will make suboptimal decisions. So it's I'll have a teaspoon of jam now instead of a jar of jam in 10 minutes time, right? To sort of really twist that analogy. And that just seems bizarre to us, right? We're not in a scarcity mindset. And we can't understand it. And then we kind of sit there and go, well, this customer can clearly afford this, and so we'll take them down a particular. This customer's clearly won't pay, right? To use the old kind of parlance, and we will treat them as a won't pay because the INE tells us that they can. But actually, when you begin to understand the psychology of humans on this and go, and the way I would say this is, if life happens to you, right, and you've lost a loved one, or you know what, you've broken your leg, and you've just got to grapple with the fact that I can't go to work for 2 weeks, how am I going to get my kids to school? So, for example, yesterday, my wife decided to have back surgery tomorrow. It was scheduled for the end of August, and somebody offered her a cancellation to bring it forward. I was in a whiz going, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to get the kids to school? I've got work, I've got this, I've got that, right? And I suddenly entered into, and I'm a relatively calm, composed, measured person, right? And then suddenly my loan company rang me and went, hey, you missed the payment. I go, well, you know, expletive deleted, I think would be my response, right? Let me deal with life right now. And so I think understanding how people enter into a scarcity mindset, understand why that might happen, where I think data from an open banking perspective can be really useful. Understanding what they might do when they're in that scarcity mindset and what they want to do and what therefore a good outcome for that customer might be, right, is really interesting. And there's also understanding that actually scarcity goes away. Scarcity is relative, right? So actually talking to me yesterday, you would have got a really bad reaction. Talking to me today, I've sort of figured stuff out. You'll have a better call with me, right? But then that's not me changing. That's not me being capricious and just being a difficult customer. That's just how humans behave according to life events, right? And that's why I'm really interested in the scarcity mindset analysis in terms of how it helps us understand customers who, look, by definition, when they enter into collections, right, whether they're vulnerable or not, life, something unexpected in life has happened to them that's meant they can't make the payments.
I mean, I'm glad the call's happening today, then, Sheraz, if based on that. I mean, Philip. I mean, I come back in terms of like real conversations with customers as an example. I mean, so I'm going to take, for example, something like Netflix subscriptions. We can rationally say you should not have a Netflix subscription, but if you're in this almost like scarcity mindset or something's happened, the Netflix might be the one piece of information that you actually get the family together, or a takeaway on Friday night, you get the family together, and it's the thing that actually you value emotionally as much as avoiding the Netflix subscription. I mean, we hear this on conversations, right? How do we rationalize and balance that versus the objectiveness and rationality of the INE in terms of the determining affordability versus what is actually a good outcome for the customer? Because not having that family time on Friday might also not be a good outcome for the customer.
I think it's,
I mean,
I think it's exactly that. I think there's a really interesting discussion around, like, there's a big difference between a bad decision and maybe sort of a mental capacity limitation, for example. And it's one that's really challenging for how we navigate. And as you touch upon, like, what is a good outcome for a customer? And I think there's only so much as a lender we can do. Like, don't get me wrong, we need to make sure that people have all the right information, that they have the right time, space, they know the consequences of actions and all of that good stuff. But I think there's only so much that we can do in terms of actually sort of the decision-making side. And I think that's the right thing. As you say, like, if that Netflix is all that someone's got at the end of a really tough week or a tough period in their life, the only entertainment they've got is that, I'm not telling my collections guys to suggest that they should cancel their Netflix. They know maybe the consequences of if they can't maintain their car payment, but ultimately, if that's their choice, then so be it. The same with maybe a family holiday and those sort of options. And the way we've tried to tailor this is, I guess, a mind shift of, rather than trying to, I guess my job isn't to convince people that paying their car finance is the right decision. It's, I guess, giving them all the tools, all the information to make the right decision. And the way our people approach this is, like, their job is to get people out of debt, not debt out of people, if that makes sense. So what I mean by that is, if they can't pay for the car, at some point it may have to come back, because that's what gets, the person out of debt. However, I think, we just need to be really careful when it comes to decision making. Like, it's subjectively bad on the outside looking in to have Netflix when you can't afford your car. At the same time, if that's what's keeping you, let's say, in a better well-being place in a really challenging period in your life, or I don't know, and this is probably that short-term thinking, but if you choose to go on holiday after your family have gone through a really rough time, but you don't pay, maybe, I'm not sure, I'm going to make this up, no offense to water company, but you don't pay your water bill, it's not going to get cut off. Are the benefits to your health from that holiday greater, if that makes sense? And I think we just need to be careful of what is a good outcome, and that we don't force our own conscious bias good outcome on people.
Yeah, I mean, Suzanne, I don't know what your reaction is to that, and I also want to just bring in, going back to what we talked about at the start, in terms of like with the cost of living, I suppose, and inflation. It's like this is not necessarily going away. I mean, like, how do we, hearing what Phillip says, how do we then put that into almost like the structure, including the lending elements as well, in terms of like thinking about the business model to a certain extent, to allow some of those things to kind of happen? I mean, what's your kind of reaction? Because it doesn't feel like this is going to go away anytime soon, right? We're still going to have this increasing kind of scarcity mindset, if what the way Sheraz was explaining about it, and we're going to have some of these like strained, or we have some of this decision making system that's going on in the background. How should we as businesses react to that, do you think?
It's almost like we prepped for this, because that's just a brilliant link into exactly how I was going to respond to Phillip. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because everything we've talked about is people's consciousness of what they're spending their money on. And I go back to what I said earlier, is most people just don't understand until they get to a position where they're being questioned about it. And even then, it's still not a comprehension. If you're interested in your money, you'll know about your money. If you're not interested, as in, you're not looking at what you've got and any savings you might have, so you're not taking an active interest. You're managing your money rather than controlling your money. And I think the collections area is missing a trick by not using open banking and not using data. And I'm flabbergasted at why. I was at an event, so we partner with a software company, Flexis, and we're trying to get some people in to use it in collections at this moment in time. And there's a of open banking data. There's a perception that people won't want to share their data. But if you look at originations, plus 80% of customers that are offered an open banking journey will share their data. The performance of the loan is better. You can track that loan over. So we, with our customers, we provide either one single access to the affordability check or an ongoing access for 90 days. And that 90 days means that the lender can then check the affordability and the ability to pay in that first 3 months when it's most vulnerable of a new loan. And we've seen a 47% increase in the success of those loans by doing that. So why are we doing that in collections? I just don't understand why we aren't using the data to help customers understand where their financial situation is, because it's black and white. It's not a question and an answer. It's not, as you say, it's not, well, you've got Netflix. It's how much you're spending. I'll use an example from myself. I've got Sky and Netflix, and my Sky it's £120. And, I've looked at it and I thought, why am I spending that? It's because I've not looked at it. So could I reduce what I spend with Sky and still have Sky? Yeah, I could. I need to ring them and organise it. So I think if you've got open banking data, which is the fact, it's what you're doing. You then layer on a great collections agent who can help the customer understand their data, can help them understand what they're looking at, rather than asking lots of questions, how much you spend on this, how much you spend on that, and then not seeing the full picture, but actually having that full picture and using the full picture to help the customer understand where they could go and have a conversation. They don't have to switch it off, but they might be able to reduce it. They might have 2 Netflix accounts. They might have Netflix, Sky, and Prime. Could you manage with one of them in the short term? You can always switch it back on again. So I don't think it's about telling people what they shouldn't do. It's about helping people understand what they are doing and then helping them maybe go and have a conversation that might reduce costs, because, as I say, people don't know what they've got and don't know how to deal with it.
And Sheraz, there's 2 quick questions there, just linking into that around data sources for affordability or data sources for vulnerability. I mean, Suzanne's mentioned open banking. I mean, what's your kind of view on that in terms of like trying to get to understand behaviorally what kind of space this customer's in, as well as almost like the objective sort of rational kind of figures to a certain extent? And there any kind of areas you think people should be looking at?
Absolutely. So without revealing too much about some of the things that we're sort of looking at, you can describe decision making in there's some academic research about this. There's basically 8 vectors, right, around which decision making is sort of being done, and you can begin to look at open banking data, because as Suzanne said, it's facts, right? It's evidence. So you can begin to look at the evidence, and actually open banking data is probably the best evidence about someone's life that you can get, right? Because spending is telling you things about spending. We currently use open banking data to do better addition and subtraction, right? Let's add things up and let's subtract things from them. We can do more adding and more subtraction, right? But it's still pretty basic kung fu, right? What I'm suggesting we can use open banking data for is mapping the data over these kind of decision-making verticals and asking ourselves what's changing. So let me give you an example, right? So it is true to say that people that enter into a scarce mindset will start to prioritize short-term pleasure over long-term pressure, right? Makes sense, right? Who cares about paying off a loan in 5 years' time if you're struggling to pay your bill next week, right? So one of the indicators of that might be some sort of variation in their spending. So, for example, spending money on fast food is considered to be something that is potentially suboptimal, right? So, if you go from having some fast food, so let's take the example: you're having a takeaway on a Friday, right? Netflix. That's your normal. That's fine. What if you start doing that 3 times a week? What does that tell you about a customer's psychological positioning right then? Right? Tells you something, doesn't it? Their behavior is changing. Might there be indication of scarcity? So maybe I should wait until I engage with them until that 3 times a week delivery goes back to once a week, as a for example, to make that then nudge we want to give to the customer to be more effective, right? How to get Sheraz today when I'm going to listen to you, as opposed to talk to Sheraz yesterday when I was going to be in a bit of a spiral, right? So that's where I think there's real massive value in open banking data and helping us to understand kind of where a customer is.
And Philip, I suppose in terms of the role of the agent though as well, which is, I mean, even your statement, I mean, that changed fundamentally from where it was like 10 years ago, but it's almost like being that almost like empathetic kind of friend to a certain extent, in terms of being able to explain the situation and rationally explain some of the things that could be done. It seems like that's almost like an increasingly important role rather than less so, which is the way we'd see it with things like automation and some of the trends we've been talking about historically.
Yeah, I think it is one of those that it's a very different job. I think that collections role, just from the things we heard this morning, the things we're discussing now, has completely changed. You know, from where Suzanne was talking about sitting down with them and really understanding what their situation is, what their expenditures are. And, you know, one thing I've been challenging recently is, I'm sure you've all heard this, but are your priority bills up to date as a question? Yeah, instantly we've had this chat in our office that we're making the assumption of what their priority bills are. And the one we always talk about is self-employed people. The mobile phone never comes up as a priority bill on sort of standard form, standard income and expenditures, but chances are their income next week is dependent on it. So no, I think the role's changed an awful lot in terms of, I guess we always challenge it. It's like, I guess it's listening more, thinking more, caring more, and doing more. Ultimately are sort of the 4 things that are now, I guess, the pinnacle of a collections role, which I think in automation, it's hard to have automation at the moment that cares more. It's probably hard to have automation at the moment that listens more. So I think there's definitely still a place for those things to happen.
I mean, Suzanne, how do you think the tech environment's going to change to sort of adapt to some of these themes? I mean, what kind of stuff have you been looking at?
I think automation is a really interesting point to raise, Philip, because as the younger generation comes forward, automation is everything. They don't want to speak to anybody, but they don't speak to anybody. So actually the use of technology, clarity of data, access to data is more and more important to help people make their own minds up. And they just want to, a chat room. They just want to bing off a question and get an answer. And that's why I come back to that point and Sheraz's point that the data, the fact, the absolute, because it's personal, it's mine, and giving it to me in a way that I can understand it, I think is going to be more and more crucial. Play it back. So again, we see in some open banking journeys, the data goes to the provider, the customer doesn't see it, and then the provider talks through it. Why wouldn't you present it back to your customer? Why wouldn't you present it and talk them through it through a digital channel and talk them through how you've got to the assessments, what you've used to get to a point of recommendation for next steps and outcomes, so that there's a visualization of that information? Because often on a phone call, and we going back to the vulnerability point, some people just can't manage the audible discussion. Give them a visual representation and they understand it better. So I think there's technology is going to and should push us all down a more of a digital route. But the point is always having options, because not everybody wants a digital route. Yes, more people will, but still maintaining that discussion. And I was talking to one of the biggest banks actually, and they're looking at their consumer duty plans. I mean, and they're even talking about actually, do people go to people's homes? If we can improve the back end, improve the process, and improve the system, exactly as you were saying, Sheraz, with pay people more, their view is the same. If we can improve all of our processes and take some costs out of the manual stuff we've been doing for years, actually we can be more personal to those who need that kind of attention.
I'd love to jump in there, Chris, right? Because so the grandfather of behavioral economics wrote this book called Thinking Fast and Slow, right? Yeah. And the hypothesis behind it, that's how much of a geek I am, right? It's there on my window shelf. I consult at least 3 times a day. So most people think fast, right? What does that mean? It means you're behaving, life's too complicated, right, to sit down and compute every decision, right? So when you throw a ball, you're not calculating the trajectory and the force, your brain just does it for you. So a lot of our thinking around decision making, whether we trust somebody, whether we like them, whether we should cross the road, it's really fast subconscious computation going on, right? And it's full of biases and heuristics, and it can cause some of that kind of, that kind of suboptimal decision making. And his theory is if you make people compute, if you make people stop and think, right, what the FCA calls appropriate friction, you might get them to do something different, which is actually optimally better, right? Now, that's kind of what Suzanne's talking about from a behavioral economics perspective, is if you present people with data and say, look, you're saying this, right? But what about that? Danny Kahneman would say what you're doing is you're kind of taking them out of their system one thinking, which is let's make the easy decision, just kind of what I think is right in the moment, to actually sitting and computing and figuring stuff out. Now, as we all know, figuring stuff out hurts your brain, right? It's difficult. No one wants to do a maths problem, right? If you can avoid it, right? Who does? So humans avoid using their slow thinking side. But sometimes it might be the customer's best interest. So I think it's really interesting, some of the things about how do we present data, but not just presenting data as a tick box, right? Like a mortgage information disclosure document, right? Making it impenetrable. Actually presenting the data could be visual, could be auditory, doesn't matter. Presenting data that's impactful and causes the consumer to potentially change their behavior. And the way you do that is to get them to change the way they're thinking, which is to come out of the system one fast thinking and into the slower computational thinking, which actually, when you're doing maths, which is finance, right, you need to be in that mindset.
Yeah, one of the comments that's just come through around whether there's a dichotomy between the first call and this call around basically, and I think I kind of reading that was almost like the difference between, I suppose, collections and the way you used to think about it versus debt advice. And I know collections is not debt advice. We should be first to say that, but being able to provide some of that support in terms of financial support. And how do we sort of navigate those sort of almost like two kind of competing ideas to a certain extent. I mean, Philip, I don't know if you saw the comment in terms of that. It's like, is there a dichotomy there between collections practitioners on the first call, and then debt advice and collections that really we're talking about around vulnerability and financial difficulty?
It did cross my mind because when Suzanne was talking through, sort of going through, maybe talking about what they're spending their money on and all sorts. It did cross my mind, very similar to those sort of introduction calls that the well-known debt management, debt charities have with people, and how far does the collections role become that? It's like, how far is it our place to be telling people, don't pay them, pay us? You're quite in a biased position, I guess, as the lender, and how credible is that advice? How trusted is the advice when it's coming from the party that is almost trying to navigate with you to pay them, if that makes sense, in terms of the behind it. So no, I was questioning myself, to be honest, where do we sit between these collections agents and whether it's debt advice, financial advice, and is it a line that, I guess this is the question they're asking, but me too, in the sense of, is it a line that we want to be blurring, crossing?
But going back to Sheraz,
do you mind if I come in there? I want to challenge that a little bit, if I may. So currently in a collections journey, it can take anything from 30 to 45 minutes that we spend on a call with a customer, vulnerable or not, getting to a point of financial understanding to get them to pay. Again, let's go back to open banking data. You could cut that down to seconds, not seconds, minutes, to a start point. You've then got a start point. And you're right, is it debt advice? Well, it's got to be, hasn't it? Because you're asking them to pay for something they've already committed to, but they've now had something happen in their lives that they can't now afford to pay. And we're sticking with and again, that old point of can't versus won't. So your collections agents, your organization is now trying to find a way in which they can get back to the position where they should be paying you for what they've got. And the only way you can do that is, again, if they're truly can't payers, is help them find a way to pay. So that surely is advice. That's support, it's advice. And I agree, I understand your point of don't pay them, pay us, but that's not what I think I'm advocating. I'm saying there are things in people's financial behaviors that when you've got the facts in front of you, you can point them in a direction to say, there are things you could do differently here. And that will help us get our money for what you owe us because you took that product out, which you agreed at the time with the right, blah, 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 all the kind of stuff you say. But I think part of the problem and the whole point of consumer duty is firms need to be more responsible in being able to support customers to understand the situation that they're in. So it's fair, clear, and therefore the outcome for both parties. Because again, the point being is the outcome for the organizations that are collecting and the outcome for the customer should be the same thing, which is better, which is the right outcome.
I mean, I quite like the idea of taking a step back and moving to a different way of thinking. It's almost like, do we become almost like the collections role becomes almost like the friend. So you're down the pub with a friend, or use the pub, and it's like it's the friend who says, actually, Chris, you shouldn't have had that haircut. It looks awful on you, right? So it's kind of like they're providing objective external facts, but they're making you think about things differently, and it's almost like as a critical friend kind of way, and it shocks you into then thinking more rationally around how you then need to deal with your situation. And I think that's quite an interesting kind of idea. Sheraz, you're going to come in.
I want to tell that. I'll tell you a quick story, right? So once upon a time, I was a bank manager, and a Nottingham Forest player came in to complain about his bank charges, right? So he must have been. This is like quite a few years ago. Forest weren't in the Premier League, and the salaries weren't that big, right? But he's a young lad, 22, 23, probably clearing 100 grand a month, right? And he's getting charges, and he came in to complain about it. And I gave him an old-fashioned earful, right? Where I said to him, all you've got to do is change the date of your direct debits, pal, right? Because right now they're coming out 3 days towards the end of the month. You get paid the first of the month. So no, I'm not holding your complaint. Now, is that debt advice? Is that, was that an appropriate response to his expression of dissatisfaction? Probably not. I didn't give him false rights, and he wasn't particularly happy with what I said. but it's still good advice, right? Just to sort out your direct debits a little bit, and so, yeah, look, I think we can overstate the problem, right? I'm entirely with Suzanne on this, right? If you want to give debt advice, go and get the permission, right? What's the FCA say? No, you can't give debt advice because, it's a conflict of interest maybe, but you can manage it, right? But actually help you deliver better outcomes to customers. The investment industry has created robo-advice, right? So that's the thing, right? So I think to some extent we are, the lack of our ambition can be the architect of our prison. Let's do some of these things, because I think these are the things that we need to do to enter into Credit 3.0.
Yeah. So just as Colin's appeared, we're almost at time, and we can talk for hours. I mean, just to quickly round up. Same question we asked on the previous one was like, if we're having this conversation in 3 years' time, what are we going to be talking about? Sheraz, maybe go first. I'll go around the group.
We're going to be talking about, wow, this cost of living crisis hasn't gone away.
And we're in vulnerability. Philip, sorry.
I think for me, one of them will be financial products and how the fin products are evolving, and then maybe how quickly the background products need to evolve to keep up with them. So new products coming to market, we're seeing all sorts, but then how quickly, whether it's credit reference agencies, affordability tools, and all of those can keep up with the pace that fintech products are evolving.
Yeah, and Suzanne, where do you think we're headed?
Well, I think firstly we'll be talking about how the last 3 prime ministers that we've had have gone. But yeah, I agree with Philip. I think we'll be talking about how we start to evolve the data streams that we're now using to become even more effective, and of course AI.
Well, fascinating conversation. Thanks so much to Philip, Suzanne, and Sheraz. I mean, great insight. Really interesting conversation. Really enjoyed it. So thank you very much. And I'm gonna pass back to Colin.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Really good, and thanks to everybody who've taken part today in terms of listening in and watching and speaking, etc. It's really, really good. Lots of interesting stuff there. As you can see, they're all up on screen now. So I hope everybody enjoyed all the discussions. Really, really good from my perspective as well. And we can't really ask, but I was really intrigued with Sheraz who the Nottingham Forest player was. But there you go. That's really good. So yeah, moving forward, just wanted to really say thank you, obviously, to the speakers in this session. Obviously, Phil, Sheraz, and Suzanne for their great feedback and input in that session is really good. Obviously thanking Chris as well for his excellent chairing. Really, really great insight that he's got from people there. So really appreciate that. But I just want to flag a couple of things that are coming up that we've got over the next couple of months. 4th of July, next Thursday, in fact, in Leeds at the Met Hotel, we're running a probably less relevant to a lot of this audience, but commercial credit and collections conference. 11th of July, we're announcing our Credit and Collections Industry Awards winners through an announcement. So really good if people want to tune into that. And more importantly, coming up ahead of that, we've got Credit and Collections Technology Awards entries. We'd love to see lots more entries into that this year. And that will culminate on the 7th of November at the Midland Hotel in Manchester. We're going to run our Credit and Collections Technology Awards in the evening, but in the day we're running another commercial credit and collections conference for people who are interested in the business space. But we'd like a lot of this audience today to join us in the day on the 7th of November at the Midland Hotel Manchester for the Credit and Collections Technology Thnk, which is more consumer focused. Great opportunity to meet, network with the industry, and obviously talk about the issues that will face us in November, which be interesting to see who's in charge of the government at that stage. But yeah, just wanted to really end by thanking everybody for today, for tuning in, and hopefully we will see you all at a future event, either virtually, but more importantly at some of these face-to-face events later on this year. But thanks everybody for your time, and hope to see you all again soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.